Welcome to the Carnivore Cast, a podcast focused on the carnivore diet and lifestyle, with practical advice from successful carnivores, citizen scientists, and top researchers. I'm your host, Scott Myslinski, and I'm here to speak with experts and experienced carnivores to get answers to your biggest and meatiest questions while helping you live your best life as a carnivore. If you enjoy the show, please consider supporting the Carnivore Cast on Patreon. By becoming a patron, you'll help us reach more people and continue to create content on carnivore. There are also exclusive perks available, such as private Q&As, consultations with me, and more. Become a supporter at patreon.com/carnivorecast. Check the episode description for the link. Thank you, and I'll see you there. Vivica Menegaz, the Nourished Caveman on Instagram, is a certified whole food nutritionist, blogger, published author, and one of the leading voices advocating for a food-based approach to healing. Vivica was the first one to use the now popular expression Keto Paleo to describe her lifestyle and way of eating. She's the founder of the Healing Foods Method, a 14-week online nutrition program where she works with one-on-one clients to turn their health around using a therapeutic ketogenic diet for healing, Keto Paleo. And tracing her back to her Italian origins, Vivica is a passionate cook whose love of healing food has been shared with millions through her blog, The Nourished Caveman. She's also the author of the upcoming book, The Essential Carnivore Diet Cookbook. Welcome to the show, Vivica.
Thank you so much for having me, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here.
Of course, the pleasure is mine, and really excited to learn more about you and your work and your background. So for folks who aren't familiar, for my audience, I'd love to just hear a little bit more about your personal health story. How did you come upon this way of eating, and how has it been for you transitioning through different diets through the years?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been quite an adventure. Like looking back just at the last 7 years, 8 years since I started being a nutritionist, and the evolution of eating, it's been quite interesting because, I grew up in Italy, and I grew up kind of in a small village in the mountains for first years of my life. So we ate a very kind of comprehensive diet. People have a very wrong idea about how Italian food really is. So, when I tell people that I grew up eating liver and brains, they're like, what? they can't believe it. But, for me, that was kind of normal, like anchovies and fried brains and pickled trout. Those are the foods of my childhood that I remember. So that was for me a very lucky start because it really, gave me this love of food, but not just a specific kind of food, just all food that is good food and nutritious food and real food. So my whole life, I never really ate junk food, luckily. So even when I moved to the United States, when I was 23, and it was kind of difficult for me to adapt to the food here in the States, but I always ate clean. And although, when you don't know better, I just ate everything pretty much like real food, but I ate bread and I ate pizza and I ate, fruit and sugar and all kinds of things. And that led me to developing gallbladder disease very early. I remember my first symptoms were in my late 20s, and I didn't even have idea what that was. I started having gallbladder attacks. And also, luckily for me, I grew up with a mother who was very interested in holistic health. So I had an acupuncturist and homeopathic doctor as a kid, and not just regular doctors. So I was, tendentially just went to look for holistic solutions before just going to a normal doctor. And just between us and the audience, I have a bit of a phobia of doctors. So sometimes I think I'm a little bit extreme in my opinions, which is not okay for everybody. But for me, I really try to stay the heck away from them. So I went to see my chiropractor who was doing nutrition, and, he diagnosed the gallbladder disease, or, told me what was going on, gave me supplements. And so I managed it for a long time, but it was getting worse and worse. And even though, I didn't know enough about diets to change my diet. So it would just give me supplements that helped me. But without changing the diet, there was no radical healing possible. And that was probably my first lesson in nutrition, that no matter how many supplements or how good of supplement you take, if your food is not right and you're eating bad foods, you're not going to be able to heal. So from that experience, many years went by and things were not good. And like I was getting regular gallbladder attacks, and probably I had other things already brewing at the time, but I didn't know it. And I didn't want to see doctors until I found my first mentor in nutrition, who was also a chiropractor. And she really wanted me to work with her. So she asked me to study nutrition. And I did. And this is Dr. Deborah Penner. And we're still really good friends with her. I ended up studying nutrition with her and working for her for 4 years in her practice. And this is how a lot of things developed very early for me. And I had an amazing experience to working with real patients pretty much from day one of studying nutrition and being part of a budding practice. And, and the first thing, of course, I applied what I was learning to myself. And so I started detoxing. And I started changing my diet. So the first step for me was a Western price-based approach. So it's like nourishing foods. And I was really big on like everything local, organic, seasonal, eating nose to tail. I was buying everything from the farmers. So I ate a really clean diet and very nutritious. And I detoxed a lot. And that helped. It reversed my gallbladder problems, and I started feeling much better. But a couple of years go by and certain issues actually started getting worse. So that was at the point I was about 47 and in perimenopause, and I started gaining weight. And I've been kind of naturally thin my whole life without having to work at it or diet excessively. And all of a sudden I gained like 30 pounds, which was a lot for me. And I couldn't understand, like, I'm doing everything right. What is it? What is it that I'm doing that, is not working for me? And I should have known, of course, hindsight 2020, because my maternal father died of diabetes, and he was a diabetic, like pretty much all his life, and diabetes killed him. So I'm like, hello, Vivica, it's right under your nose. But one day I just started measuring my blood sugar, and I found out that I was already pre-diabetic. And that was like rude awakening, number one there, So and through that realization led me to research, and that led me to find out about ketogenic diets. And this is about 7-8 years ago, or maybe more, where nobody talked about keto. Nobody knew what keto was. Like, there was a couple of very obscure authors, aside from Maria Emmerich, who's like, she's been kind of like the trailblazer of keto. And I remember buying her book. And then there was another book written by a bodybuilder about cyclical ketogenic diets. And that's how it started. So I immediately saw the benefits. I immediately understood that this was the ticket. This is the way. And restricting carbohydrates is really important when you have insulin issues. So I just dove in myself. And for the first year, I was super strict. I did a Paleolithic ketogenic diet. I call it Keto Paleo. That was my lifestyle. I eliminated dairy because of my hormones and, perimenopause and all of that side of the deal. But for insulin related issues, I just did a good strict ketogenic diet. And within a year, I lost all the weight. I was back in great shape. I started exercising more than ever. I had tons of energy. All the little aches and pains in my body that people were saying, oh, it's just you're aging, you're 47. Those were all gone. And I honestly felt like I reversed 10 years of aging, and I looked and felt great at that point. But things are never so easy, right? And when you're on a path of digging deeper, then you keep digging and things keep coming up. So in doing my panels and everything, I found out that I was hypothyroid. And then as I started working with a new mentor who specializes in functional endocrinology, I also found out that I had Hashimoto's. And it wasn't one of those huge, super high cases of super high antibody markers, but it was there and it was present. And I know that it could have got worse. So definitely tightened up my diet further at that point and dove into hormones. And that's what led me to become kind of a hormone specialist, because I also was in perimenopause and I had fibroids and the Hashimoto's and the hypothyroidism. So at that point, I was like, fully committed to resolving my issues through nutrition and through diet, through food. So that led to quite a bit of experimentation, because after a year being very low carb, I was like around 20, 30 grams of carbs a day and, eating kind of like a varied protein diet. I never skimped on protein. I was always being like a protein girl more than just like a high fat girl. I always had plenty of fat, but not, I've never been one of those people that did 80% fat. I think I was always heavier on the protein than most people that do keto. And using, green veggies, like, a lot of heirloom lettuces and non-cruciferous greens. And that was kind of like the base of my diet. But at some point, I realized that wasn't working so good anymore. And that was like about 2.5, 3 years into keto. And so I had to start experimenting again. And that's where I started creating variations in my diet where I used carbs. I reintroduced carbs and used them like strategically, kind of like as a supplement more than as a food, like staple food, definitely not. But using them to manage like the symptoms of perimenopause and hormonal imbalances and my cortisol craziness. So all of that, using the food that I was eating really as the base of the therapy, plus, everything else that comes with nutrition, like the whole food supplements and the herbal remedies, etc. And then something very interesting happened. I was working with a client on a year-long program, and she was having some really, really major issues that we were struggling with. And she's, brilliant young woman, super intelligent, and really experienced in a lot of things. She was vegan for many years. So we went from vegan to vegetarian to keto paleo. And then she decided that she wanted to go carnivore. And I kind of freaked out because I could not have her as a patient doing something that I hadn't done. So I decided that I had to try the carnivore diet for myself as she was starting to do it. And we would be able to have sort of a control. And this is 4 years ago. So 3.5 years ago, there was not a lot of information about carnivore. So, we're talking about kind of a blank slate where you don't find all the podcasts, all the doctors doing research, all the precious Ted Naimans out there who give you good guidelines, scientific guidelines. I'm not a scientist. I'm just a little, certified nutritionist, but I apply common sense and I apply a lot of clinical experimentation that with my clients I get to do together. And so in that point, I had to try carnivore for myself. And I learned a lot from the PKD, Paleolithic Ketogenic Diet, and those guys in Hungary from Paleomedicina. They're amazing scientists again, and they did some really foundational work, I think, for the healing benefits of carnivore. But after learning from them, my patient and I kind of went to separate directions because she really embraced PKD and she went to work for them and became one of their team. And me, on the other hand, I did a strict carnivore for 3 months. And then I realized that was not the right thing for me. But even that experiment, it totally changed, it took my personal way of eating a step further in what really works for me. So it kind of like, went through this whole evolution of eating from like nutrient dense foods and Western price, and kind of at this point coming back full cycle to what we can call these days a meat-based diet, where like my diet is definitely about 80%, sometimes 90% animal products. But it's more based on like, at this point, like real foods. And again, like with the principles of like clean foods, organic foods, local, seasonal, as much as possible, from the farmer directly, controlling the source and the origin of the foods that I eat, avoiding anything that's processed and manufactured as much as possible. And with a big focus on eating nose to tail. So that's been quite, a journey with that. And that's kind of where I'm at right now with things.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing. That's incredible. And I'm super impressed by your resiliency through all of it, Vivica. Like feeling like you've worked so hard at something and learned so much and found the answers and found what's right for you. And then it changing over and over again. I can imagine is just extremely challenging and frustrating in so many ways. But your ability to adapt and stay responsive and resilient through it is really unbelievable to me. And your healing foods method, can you talk a little bit about what that is and how it works in Keto Paleo and like where in your journey it came along for you and some of the people you use that with?
Yeah. So the program really started when I was working for the practice, and my boss, mentor, she asked me to create a program for her patients for the ketogenic diet. So I probably would have never come up with it by myself, but she gave me this job to create a program, and it started out as like an 8-week program. So I had to put together like all my resources, and then we started the first couple of cycles of the program, and it was in person in the practice. It was really awesome because I got to see everybody in person once a week. And then eventually I kind of started evolving out of that job and wanted to start my own practice. And so I did learn. I went with a coach that taught me how to create online programs and how to put all my knowledge into a format that was available to a wider audience. And that for me was really valuable because, at that time I was living on top of a mountain on a homestead. So it's really hard, like, to find a public, there are not that many people around there to teach the program to. So bringing the program online was a huge step. And I got to say, I never expected for the program to take off the way it did. It was really successful. It's been really successful for about 5 years now. And I also had incredible people believing in me and referring clients to me, like Leanne Vogel and Sean Miner, that I immensely respect. And they just kept sending people to me. So I was like, okay, I must be doing something right. But yeah, the program is really based on healing diets. And I say keto paleo, but I have also, in the meantime, probably outgrown that term. It's really hard to define. I'm not good at giving names, but, I can only call it like a healing diet or a healing way of eating that has so many components, because I'm really big on ancestral diets. And I've learned a lot about ancestral evolution and the ancestral way of eating and the woes of the modern diet. And this is both through Weston Price and his work and other, more modern approaches to ancestral living and diets. And so that for me is a really important piece of the puzzle. But then there is the evolution of through the whole farming experience and what that has done to us. And then there is all these new discoveries with the DNA and genetics and epigenetics and how that piece of the puzzle plays into it. And then there is, of course, individuality and the history of the individual person, like what have they done to themselves in their lives? Like, have they yo-yo dieted for 40 years? Have they like done low fat like crazy and super high sugar and they didn't even know it for 40 years? So there is a lot that needs to be taken in consideration when it comes to reversing the damage that we have done to ourselves, through our unknown bad habits. Or some people, they just don't know better because look at what the FDA tells you, or the crazy dietary regulations. By the way, they just came out again with the same crap. Excuse my English. But totally. It really makes me mad. I don't know how graphic I can be on your podcast.
As graphic as you need. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's freaking horrible. And like, they still like, we're still headed that way for the masses. And that is really, what with the work that I do and the program, I want to create at least one point of opposition, of an alternative to what is offered to the masses. And that's why, number one, I work with people individually. I used to do groups. And now I was like, no, I can't really do the work that I truly want to do if I'm in a group. I need to give people more attention, individual attention. So I started just working with individual clients. And then like, instead of like, you can find so much generic advice on the internet. And there is some really awesome advice. And there are so many brilliant minds and, all these new people like you and the people you interview that give you all this knowledge. But at the end of the day, it's like, how do you apply to your specific case? And this is sometimes I feel like the missing link. And there are people who will do just great with generic advice because their issues are not that deeply rooted. But there are also a lot of people who have such complex cases that it's like a big ball of yarn that's like super tangled up. And they need help to detangle it. So this is where is the work that I want to offer to people, it goes deeper instead of wider.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense, Vivica. And I'm nodding my head at everything you're saying because I think, I think carnivore, keto, paleo, these templates of diet, these frameworks are really simple and easy to explain. And that's why they're successful. And for people who don't know a lot about nutrition, which is most people, they get people to a quick home run on, prioritizing whole foods, protein, nutrient-dense foods, cutting out a lot of the processed crap, and paying attention to how you feel and trying to make yourself full, high satiety foods, etc. But there is a ton of nuance, and that's where individualizing the approach and working one-on-one with clients is super valuable and very important. And one area where you have a ton of expertise and experience is carnivore for women, and especially for women who are perimenopause or menopause. Can you explain some of the nuances there? I'm obviously not experienced in this area and not qualified to talk about it, but you certainly are and know a lot. So please share.
Yeah, it's actually, it's a kind of little niche that a lot of times I feel like in a modern conversation about carnivore and even ketogenic has been largely kind of ignored. I feel like, especially in the carnivore space, although there are many carnivore women, it seems like they tend to be younger mostly. And not many of the ones that are like relevant in the space of education seem to have gone through perimenopause and menopause themselves and, experimented with diet and with carnivore throughout the whole process. I was lucky enough to not just, my little experiment with strict carnivore wasn't even that valuable as much as it gave me at least a foundation of knowledge so I could work with patients with carnivore and see how we had to adapt the diet to their needs as they went through these shifts. Especially, there is a period of time that is between like the end of perimenopause and the start of menopause that things just kind of go crazy in a woman's body. Your hormones are like all over the place. They're very unstable. It's like a big transition. And because of like the kind of environment we live in these days, and like the hormone pollution, all the xenohormones and the foods and like all the chemicals and all this toxicity, it really creates hell in a woman's hormones. And so this time is really delicate. And plus, we don't have a lot of research and a lot of science to be based on when it comes to perimenopause and menopause transition, because it seems like women, people are able to get older now. And also the world is very different than like, let's say 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So this is like a whole new scenario, hormonally speaking, that we have to deal with as women. And like, how do we support these changes? And like, if nothing else, look at the stress levels that every year gets worse, right? Every year we say, oh my goodness, this year was bad. Like next year is going to be better. And instead it's like more crazy, complicated, like all kinds of stuff is happening. So that all of this affects the women's hormones. So like, how does the diet support these processes versus hindering? And I want to just say that for me, the main benefit of doing a carnivore diet in general for anybody is that it's a really clean, easy, nutritious, and, nutrient-dense elimination diet. And it gives a lot of like healing benefits, especially with people who have damaged intestines and, completely messed up microbiome, leaky gut, use of antibiotics, all of those things. So the carnivore diet by itself has, the opportunity to just bring a lot of healing to those areas. And so many people, I would think the majority of people in America deal with gut issues and, because of like the way that people are raised here. So that is like the staple for me, the foundation of benefit of the carnivore diet. But then how do you deal with clients who are, have gut issues and maybe autoimmunity and hormone craziness on top? So they're in perimenopause and like maybe they're estrogen dominant, maybe they have fibroids like I did, or they have PCOS and like their doctors want to take all their stuff out, complete hysterectomies, which is one of the top surgeries these days, by the way, in America. Pretty sad. So we need to like, for me, it's always like a scale, you have the two places of the scale, and a lot of times balancing like metabolic needs versus hormonal needs, or balancing, autoimmune intestinal needs versus hormonal needs, it's two things that you need to find that balance point in the middle. So with carnivore, I realized that a lot of women that are my clients that were doing a strict carnivore in this delicate transition time, they had trouble doing it. So they didn't have that great energy. They, still had brain fog and like had crashes. Sleep problems is a big one, and symptomatic as well, like all the symptoms, hormonal symptoms, like night sweats, or, adrenal symptoms or liver congestion symptoms. So what I found is like introducing like medicinal carbs, let's call them, into this like carnivore base, it really brought a lot of benefits for them and enabled them to like be compliant and sustainably be on the carnivore diet for the period of time that they needed for the other healing. So with an eye on the hormone health as well. And that has been working out really good for me. And in fact, this is something that I talk about in the book, the Essential Carnivore Diet Cookbook. Man, they couldn't pick a longer title, right? So the cookbook, I do talk about it in it. And that's why I also presented like with my co-author, Erin, who's awesome. She's awesome. And it's great because she's in a very different area of expertise than I am. So she's more in, the fitness world. She's a CrossFit competitor and she's a lot younger than me. She's in her 30s. So her needs are very different than what my needs or my clients' needs would be. But together, we put our heads together and created different versions. We call them carnivore styles of the diet that people could use for different applications. And for me, one of the big, one of the things I had to have in the book was to be able to tailor that to the hormonal needs of women as their hormones change. So that's more like, we call it an ancestral style, where there are specific carbs included. And we use like honey and some fruit, like the most neutral possible, healthiest kinds of fruit, but to bring in carbs. But even just that little bit makes a huge difference when it comes to like helping your hormones.
Yeah, that's amazing. And what I'm sure it's individualized for everyone, but like what levels of carbs have you found work really well for women in that situation?
It is kind of individualized, but if I had to make it kind of a general guideline, I think that maybe like a 5 to 10% carbs of the whole calories of the day is enough. And that kind of keeps you still in ketogenic ratios, which is, I find that leveraging the benefits of ketosis is great. I am these days much more inclined to do cyclical, my English sometimes, cyclical ketogenic versus just like keto all the time and ketosis all the time. So using the carbs and the ketosis both, so that you can have that relief. And mostly the carbs are used like in the second part of the day. And, I forgot where I was going. So like we say 5 to 10% of the calorie intake. And depending, what I was going to say is depending on the level of activity and, the lean muscle mass of the individual, then we can modulate their carb usage. And also, of course, insulin resistance is a big factor. But another thing that I think has been, found through the research and experimentation with ketogenic is that, it comes a point where you've been very low carb for a long period of time, where you develop what's called physiological insulin resistance, which is not necessarily bad per se. But I find that when that starts happening, and you can tell that happens because your blood sugars, if you track blood sugars throughout the day, you will see that your morning reading will start hovering around 100. So you got really low, like sometimes down into the 70s and 60s, doing keto is great. And then suddenly it pops back up in the morning, and then it kind of normalizes down after you eat. So that for me is the sign that you are developing this physiological insulin resistance. And Dr. Jason Fung, by the way, speaks about this, and he's like, he's a scientist. I'm not, remember? So he really tells you all the scientific background of why this happens. So I recommend reading his books. His work is amazing. But how do we break that? So when you reintroduce some strategic carbs at that point, you resensitize yourself to insulin. And I think that's something that bodybuilders have known for a long time, and they use it, like they use the carbs strategically to get leaner and, to accomplish certain goals. So I think that we can learn from a lot of different scenarios and then apply that learning to the individual in the scenario that they're in. Not necessarily everything crosses over from one picture to the other. So like, for example, like the bodybuilder to the CrossFit athlete to the marathon runner to the sedentary perimenopausal woman or menopausal woman, So those are very different cases, and some things really cross over well and some things don't. So it's like common sense for me and a lot of clinical experimentation. And that's the beauty of working with people in death, is that you really get to fine tune things with them to the point where like, oh, now it's working. Yay.
Yeah. That's wonderful. I think you've come up with a really smart approach, and everything you're saying makes a lot of sense. to me as well. And Vivica, I'd love to just have you chat a little bit more about the book, the Essential Carnivore Diet Cookbook. First of all, like, you have so much experience in cooking and we haven't even talked about it. So before we dive into the cookbook itself, can you talk about the role cooking has played in your life and your health journey? And then we can dive into the specifics of this book.
Yeah, totally. I love to talk about cooking. It's one of my favorite things. For me, cooking is really kind of therapeutic at many different levels. It's like, instead of being a chore, is one of my favorite stress relieving activities, because I get in the zone, like a musician will like get in the zone when they play. I get in the zone when I'm cooking, and it's really, nourishing at all levels. For me, it kind of reminds me, I grew up in a restaurant, by the way, in Italy. So as a little tiny kid, I was running around in the kitchen all the time. And I guess it feels like home. But I also love food in general. I love traveling and eating all kinds of foods in different countries. And the weirder, the better, So experimenting with food and making it nutrition and enjoyable is really always a big goal of mine, because I think that, to be sustainable, for a lifestyle to be sustainable for long term, it needs to be enjoyable, and like sometimes I butt heads with Americans, because like for a lot of Americans, like the way they grew up, like they enjoy things that are really unhealthy, like donuts or, like really bad pizza. And that's what they ate as children. And so it's hard to train people out of that, program and like reprogram their taste bud. Literally, it takes time, and you need to provide some viable alternatives. So I think that providing like a variety of options, and also like, really tasty options, is really good when it comes to people learning how to appreciate healing foods. So, and this book is my fourth one. And I got to say that I had a lot of fun writing the book and cooking the book, because I was not a meat expert before. Like the publisher suggested, actually it was my publisher, because they were going to publish a second edition of my previous book, which is now coming out in second edition under a new name. It's called Keto Cooking for Healing and Weight Loss. And it was before the Keto Paleo Kitchen, which nobody knew what I was talking about. So they changed the title. And then they asked me if I wanted to include new recipes. And I say, why don't we include some carnivore recipes? And they're like, oh no, let's just do a carnivore book. And I was like, all right, but I'm not really a meat cooking expert. So of course, I had to become one. And I learned how to cook meat in so many better ways and different ways, and really be good at cooking meat and make it easy for people. Because I imagine if I can't do it, how many people out there don't know how to cook meat in a way that is like still compliant. Like if you're a strict carnivore and it's just meat and salt, like you got to get pretty creative there to get some variety, and not everybody is like Sean Baker is like a ribeye a day, I mean, I like my ribeye a day too, but I do get bored sometimes, and I do want some variety, because my staple is still meat. I would say that that's like the strong foundation of my diet. So yeah, it was really fun to like, and also, I like to say I'm a nose to tail fan, and I think that eating organ meats is really important. As much as we can avoid supplementing and eating real food, I try to do that, especially with my patients, where I already have to give them supplements for detoxing, supplements for unplugging their livers, for supporting their kidneys, for regulating their hormones. So, it adds up fast. So like, I'm not going to give you supplements for nutrition. The nutrition needs to come from your food. So for me, the most nutritious foods are organ meats, like liver, bone marrow, even brain, kidney, whatever you can find as more nutrients than anything else, pretty much. And especially liver is like I'm a liver lover.
Yeah.
And like, since like Western price days where like I taught like the whole town of Chico to cook liver. It's been like a real passion for me. Like, why would you want to take another supplement when you can just eat it and have an enjoyable meal and not having to take a pill? So that's kind of the philosophy behind a lot of the recipes that I try to create.
That's awesome. And I love the idea of calling organ meats the foundation of health. I personally love liver, eat it multiple times a week. And it was definitely an acquired taste. You can totally understand people who are not there yet. And that's where things like your cookbook come in, as well as supplements, I think could be really useful. But yeah, I'm super excited to dig into your cookbook and try some of the recipes, and really happy that I got to meet you, Vivica, and you came on and shared a bit of your story. I'm sure folks will want to learn more about you. Where can they find you and follow along with your work and your journey as well?
So my website, my blog is theNourishedCaveman.com. I do got to say, though, that I haven't posted on the blog for a while now. I'm kind of coming away from that name and just that identity and expanding. Things are always changing, always moving. I haven't quite launched my new website, but in the meantime, theNourishedCaveman.com is still a valid place. And of course, I've been active mostly on Instagram these days. So it's the Nourished Caveman on Instagram. And of course, there is my email, and I just give people my email and say, just send me an email directly if you have a question. And the email is vivica@thenourishedcaveman.com. So that's probably the best way. And through my blog, there is a contact form. It talks about my program. And then I have a YouTube channel with a lot of videos, and there is a great knowledge base about diet and especially hormones, thyroid, adrenals, and female hormones. So that's a good resource as well.
Awesome. Well, I'll have links to all of that in the show notes and at carnivorecast.com. And really appreciate you coming on today, Vivica. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I think folks will absolutely love this.
Thank you so much, Scott. And thank you for the great work you do in bringing this information to people. This is very, very needed, and I very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for saying that. Have a great day.
You too.
If you enjoy the show, please consider supporting the Carnivore Cast on Patreon. By becoming a patron, you'll help us reach more people and continue to create content on carnivore. There are also exclusive perks available, such as private Q&As, consultations with me, and more. Become a supporter at patreon.com/carnivorecast. Check the episode description for the link. Thank you, and I'll see you there. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Carnivore Cast. If you enjoyed this episode, please review on iTunes. It really helps us out. And share it with a friend. What questions would you like answered? Or who would you like to hear from in the carnivore research community? You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at CarnivoreCast, or go to carnivorecast.com. You can also email me at info@carnivorecast.com. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep it carnivore.